Those of us who see Donald Trump as a threat to democracy agree that he must be defeated in November. From trying to overturn the last election he lost to promising to use the force of law to exact revenge on his enemies if he returns to power, to the 900-plus page playbook known as Project 2025, which lays out a detailed plan for seizing and consolidating power, the danger is clear and present. But we seem to have lost sight of all of this in the last 9 days for some valid reasons. Since President Joe Biden's performance in the first presidential debate, there's been much debate among the punditry about his competency to run, along with justified anger toward the team that surrounds him. But without dismissing the legitimacy of those concerns, this election remains about one thing and one thing only: the threat of losing our democracy. And that is where our efforts at convincing one another need to be spent. You can list all of Biden's flaws, and you'd still be left with the same conclusion. Only one of the two main presidential candidates poses an existential threat to democracy. No doubt Biden's debate performance was a collective shock to the system, in part a consequence of mounting frustrations in recent years that reached a climax that evening. Since witnessing a mob of extremists overtake the nation's capital, we've been battered by a series of events that have shaken this nation's foundations to its core. From the battle to rewrite American history in our schools, to book bans and organized efforts led by extremist judges, attorneys general, and Christian nationalists to forces to roll back civil rights. Before we can fully process one crisis, we're hit with another. For so long, many of us naively believed that our democracy is infallible. These threats can never flourish here. But the actions of extremists in recent years, with the help from the Supreme Court, have shattered that illusion, leading us to this moment. The current rage, the confusion, the bickering are all different and valid manifestations of our collective anguish. We grieve that our 248-year-old democracy has reached this precarious point, teetering on the edge of uncertainty. But now more than ever, it's crucial that we hold our ground. It's crucial that we maintain perspective. Whatever happens with Biden, whether he steps aside or stays the course, the Democratic nominee, any Democratic nominee, will be a better option than the alternative, which is the downfall of American democracy. None of this dismisses the legitimacy of concerns about Biden. None of this absolves the media and the Democratic establishment of their failures. Understanding how we reach this point demands a reckoning that must occur. But American politics right now is a big building on fire, and discussing whether the building had enough sprinklers in it is not the discussion for right now. There will be ample opportunity for reflection if democracy prevails. But if extremists seize control in November, that will be the least of our concerns. This week, we celebrated 248 years of independence from the oppressive shackles of a tyrannical king. Shortly before the 50th anniversary of American independence, in 1826, Thomas Jefferson would write his last public letter. His words resonate even more strongly today. He referred to himself as one of the surviving signers of a declaration pregnant with our own and the fate of the world. He continued, "It's good to know that, quote, our fellow citizens, after half a century of experience and prosperity, continue to approve the choice we made. Let the annual return of this day forever refresh our recollections of these rights and an undiminished devotion to them," end quote. There's a paradox worth mentioning here when you talk about Jefferson. Despite working to establish a new nation founded on the principles of freedom and liberty, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. And the nation's founding document, which he authored, did not move to abolish slavery. Since Jefferson penned those words, those rights have been extended to black people and to other minorities and to women, with each generation building upon the last. Since declaring independence, our great American experiment has been tested over and over again. We have sacrificed many lives to safeguard liberal values both at home and abroad. During World War II, the world was divided into two camps, democratic versus fascist forces. Where America stood was clear, and it played a crucial role in liberating Western Europe from totalitarianism. Our contribution solidified our position as a global superpower. Consider how differently that war may have played out if we had a demagogue steering America off the cliff, much like we might have after November's election. Today, Our great American experiment is at risk of collapse. Rid yourself of the notion that this is simply a race between two parties. This is a fight to preserve our hard-fought freedoms. We have two candidates. One stands for democracy, and one doesn't. That's the beginning and the end of the realization that voters need to have. Biden's condition, whether it's tiredness or something else, is certainly not irrelevant, but it's almost irrelevant. 74 million people voted for Donald Trump in the last election. 81 million people voted for Joe Biden. The failure is that after 4 years of Donald Trump, more eligible voters didn't vote than voted for either candidate. Even after 4 years of Donald Trump's disastrous policies and in the middle of the COVID crisis that Donald Trump made much worse than it needed to be. This moment, and I'm not sure who should be at the top of the ballot, but this moment transcends Joe Biden or any of our feelings about him. Our effort now is nothing less than the preservation of democracy. More than 2 centuries after the Founding Fathers rejected tyranny, we find ourselves summoned to a similar call to defend and uphold the principles of democracy. Our job as citizens is to choose democracy, whomever is carrying that flag into the next election. And with its latest decision, the Supreme Court just helped them move another giant step closer to achieving that goal. Joining me now is Laurence Tribe, professor of constitutional law emeritus at Harvard Law School, author of many important books, including American Constitutional Law and To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment. Professor Tribe, thank you for being here. I conflated a few things because there were a couple of Supreme Court decisions that all have influence around this. Of course, the big one was on Monday morning. You tweeted this morning that you're going to come on the show and tell us about ways we can push back against this unprecedented ruling. So I open the floor to you.
Thanks, Ali, and thank you for having me on again. Yes, it is important to not simply roll over and play dead in the face of this astonishing ruling, because the ruling itself depends on several things. One of the things it depends on is the union of the presidency with the prosecutorial arm of the government. In over 40 states and in many nations, that mistake isn't made. The prosecutorial arm is not under the thumb of the chief executive of the nation. So one of the things we can do, although it's always uphill to amend the Constitution, is begin considering creating an institutionalized independence. I had an op-ed in the New York Times a few days ago proposing that. A second thing that we can do is directly address this absurd notion that anyone in this country is above the law. I propose that in addition to creating independence, real independence for the prosecutorial arm, that we adopt an amendment that I think an overwhelming majority of the country would immediately favor, and that is essentially, though the language would need to be tweaked, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to confer immunity on any individual from the operations of the criminal law by virtue of an office that individual previously held. A third thing we can do is begin treating the Supreme Court itself as one of the issues in this election. I'm not in favor of the impeachment resolutions that I think are going to be introduced against Justices Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito, because I think that can boomerang, and I'm not sure that they have committed technically impeachable offenses, though they probably have. I am in favor of taking a close look at Supreme Court reform. I was a member of President Biden's Commission on Supreme Court Reform a couple of years ago. We studied the court for over a year, compared it to the apex courts of other countries. It is the only apex court that is highest court in the land anywhere with anything like this kind of power that has less than 13 to 15 members. So the court needs to be enlarged. Indeed, unfortunately, part of Project 25 commits the new president, if it happens to be Trump, to replacing the elderly right-wing justices, probably replacing the 70-something justices, Thomas and Alito, with decades younger far-right justices. But beyond that, we need to look at term limits, and most important, we need to have an enforceable code of ethics, not simply one that is up to the court itself to enforce. And if there were an inspector general or some other device to enforce that code, then Alito and Thomas surely would not have voted in two of the major cases this year, the one that would have taken Trump off the ballot, and now the one that makes Trump virtually a king. It's also important to realize that the court has now facilitated Project 2025's aspiration to deconstruct the administrative state. This court, in the Loper-Bright decision, basically, without getting technical, said that the alphabet soup of administrative agencies, the EPA, the FDA, the SEC, all of the post-New Deal agencies are now subject to plenary, open-ended review by the federal courts, no deference to their expertise. So we now have an imperial judiciary walking arm in arm with an imperial executive. And we need to take these things not as given just because the highest court in the land has said so, but as inconsistent with our aspirations to democracy and to a functioning government.
So of those practical things that you talk about, term limits, ethical enforcement, perhaps with an inspector general, or the expansion of the court, what's the most doable in the current political climate that we have?
I think the inspector general enforcing a code of ethics is the most doable, but we can't limit ourselves to the easiest things. We're never going to get to the top of the mountain unless we start the journey. And throughout our history, we have treated the Constitution sometimes too much as a sacred, unamendable document. We've only amended it 27 times. We have to remember that we have in the past amended it to solve serious problems. And the amendment process, unlike the legislative process, bypasses the presidency. There is no role for the president in amending the Constitution. And we need to put those amendments on the table.
Professor Tribe, we appreciate the thought that you put into this and the fact that you are not, like so many people, throwing up their hands and saying, despite how perverse this decision seems to be, that there's no road forward. So we always appreciate your time. Lawrence Tribe is a professor emeritus of constitutional law at Harvard Law School. He's the author of the books American Constitutional Law and To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment, among many others. Joining me now is Quentin Fulks. He's the principal deputy campaign manager for the Biden-Harris campaign. Quentin, good morning to you. Thank you for being with us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Quentin, I want to play part of that ABC News interview of the president and ask you about it on the other side. Let's listen together.
And if you stay in and Trump is elected and everything you're warning about comes to pass, how will you feel in January?
I feel as long as I gave it my all and I did the goodest job as I know I can do. That's what this is about.
Quentin, I want to get your sense of that response, because that seems to be central to the question, right? There are not people who would otherwise support a Democratic candidate or the president himself who don't think he would be a better president than Donald Trump, or a safer president for democracy than Donald Trump. The issue seems to be coming down to whether people can be convinced that Joe Biden can beat Donald Trump in November.
Well, look, I think that what the president was trying to say is that there's nobody that's going to fight harder to defeat Donald Trump than he is, and that he is going to give it his all, which is what we've seen him doing in the wake of a performance which he himself admits wasn't his best. But we have seen the president go out. We have seen the president go to speeches, fundraisers, continue to do the work of somebody who is running to be president of the United States. And I think that that is what the president is saying. We also heard the president lay out the stakes of this election and the fact that Donald Trump does not care about himself. He likes to use the term morals of an alley cat, but that is factual. That is who Donald Trump is. And when has Donald Trump done anything for anybody but himself? It's the only reason that he is in this race to begin with. And I think that President Biden was saying that he is in this race and is going to continue to work as hard as he can, and that he is the most qualified person. And for the past 3.5 years, he has been working nonstop to deliver for the American people.
And so, and I think no one can take issue with both the record of Joe Biden. In my case, I study the economy, and it's been very strong. But on a number of other issues, including a number of foreign affairs issues, and the fact that you're running against a guy who looks to be interested in dismantling democracy. However, that doesn't stop the fact that the Washington Post is reporting that the Virginia Senator Mark Warner is preparing to make the case to the president himself that he step aside. And after the debate, it took a number of days for either President Biden or the campaign to reach out to congressional members and leaderships. We've heard from some members of Congress who wanted to speak to the president directly that he didn't reach out and the campaign didn't reach out. Is that changing?
Look, the president has reached out to a number of elected officials. He's spoken to Speaker Pelosi, or former Speaker Pelosi. He's spoken to Leader Jeffries, spoken to Leader Schumer. He has met with Democratic governors in the White House. He has been doing call time, calling through members. So the president is reaching out. That is our campaign. We understand the strength of the Democratic coalition, as we have been utilizing them from the outset of this campaign to communicate to voters, as they are the best surrogates for what the president has done and under his leadership. And so we're going to continue to do that. But look, at the end of the day, the fundamentals of this race haven't changed. The horse race in this race have not changed. We just saw a poll this morning showing that the president has narrowed all swing states. In states like Wisconsin and Michigan, he is actually leading. So we're going to continue to put in the work to make sure that we are communicating to voters, because the campaign that runs the hardest and communicates to as many people as they can is going to win. And while we're communicating to those people, we know that the issues are on their side. When these voters continue to see President Biden deliver substance after substance in his speech, talking about the issues that they are talking about at their kitchen tables, that is what's going to decide this election, and that is where the American people are, which is why the fundamentals of this race have not changed. Nothing after the debate changed about the fact that Donald Trump wanted to rip away reproductive freedoms for women. Nothing changed about the fact that Donald Trump wants to give tax breaks to billionaires. Nothing changed about the fact that Donald Trump wants to be a dictator in the Supreme Court with their immunity ruling that he largely appointed, have now just given him the keys to get closer to that. And so that is why the stakes of this election haven't changed, and the voters know President Biden is on their side, and that is why they continue to have his back. And that is the leverage that we're going to continue to take into November and win this election.
So I get it, and we're not arguing about this. I think the fundamentals are the same. I think the record remains the same. Donald Trump's record remains worse than it's ever been. The issue still comes down to something the president said to George Stephanopoulos last night, something you've said to me this morning, that he believes, and I guess you believe, that he is in the best position to win this election, that no one will fight harder than he is. And there are people who validly believe that not to be true. How do you answer that? A fundraising email that you sent out concerned with the debate performance called those people who are worried about it bedwetters. So what's the president's plan over the next week or so to demonstrate not that he's a better candidate, not that he'd be a better president, not that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy? All of those things are provably true, but that he has the ability to win in a close election.
Well, look, I think he's got to continue to put in the work. You heard me lay out his robust travel schedule after the debate, going to do a speech on immunity, talking about extreme heat, going to a fundraiser in New York, going to Wisconsin to give a speech to thousands of supporters yesterday, continuing to do sit-down interviews. That is where the president's mindset is. He understands that he has to assure the American people, and that's why he's going to continue to robustly campaign with a robust travel schedule over the next several weeks to make sure that we're getting in front of as many voters as possible. I mean, look, and we're not arguing about this, but at the end of the day, no one can begrudge President Biden. Every single elected official that runs has to believe that they are the best option. They have to believe that they can represent the people, and they have to believe that they are qualified enough and understand the legislative system, and can lead enough to get things done for American people. The stakes are extremely high. And when we see things like Project 2025 and Donald Trump continuing to double down on gutting government agencies like the Department of Education, using the Comstock Act to ban abortion medication from women. Those are the stakes of this election, and President Biden believes that he is qualified, as he has demonstrated with his body of work, not just this past 3.5 years, but throughout his entire career, that he can lead. And that is what he is going to do, and he is going to continue to put in the work day in and day out on the campaign trail, as well as in the Oval Office as the leader of the free world, to make sure that Americans see that day in and day out.
Okay, so you talked about Project 25. I've got it here. It's too big to even bind in one book because it's 900 plus pages. It has a remarkable name. It's called Mandate for Leadership. Now, based on this, Quentin, and based on who Donald Trump wants to install in positions of power should he win, people like Stephen Miller, people like Vivek Ramaswamy, people like Rick Grenell, people like Kash Patel, and the very specific threats that they have made to seek revenge and retribution on those who oppose them, which, by the way, include you and me both. Is it important, or is it something you've thought about, for the president's cabinet and the president's advisors to be a bigger presence on television and on the campaign trail to emphasize the team that is behind this president?
It's absolutely important, and it's important from the standpoint of diversity and inclusion. It's important. You've heard the president say routinely that he wants an administration that looks like America. He has been the vice president to the first black president. He is the president to the first female vice president and black female vice president. He has put a black woman on the Supreme Court. His cabinet is diverse as America. And so it is absolutely important that people see that their perspectives are being brought to the table. And that is what the president's cabinet looks like. That is the work that is going in. And it's why the issues from a legislative standpoint and the policies that have been put in place over the last couple of years reflect a broad range of issues and topics and constituency groups because those issues are being brought to the table directly to the president by people that he has put in place. And so we are going to continue to do that.
Let me ask you, because we talked to our reporters, all the networks did, after the interview last night, and their word from the campaign in the White House was that they thought the president hit it out of the park in that interview. Do you feel that way?
Look, the president had a broad interview. He answered tough questions after a debate performance where everybody has been telling him that he should exit the race. And he defied expectations. I think that the president showed up. He just gave a speech. He answered every single question. He laid out the stakes, again, talking about the substance. He laid out his body of work for his career in the past 3.5 years, standing up for Americans' freedoms and rights across this country. And so, yes, President Biden delivered.
Quote, taking turns, they carried the big PRC-77 Scrambler radio, which weighed 30 pounds with its battery. They shared the weight of memory. They took up what others could no longer bear. Often, they carried each other, the wounded or weak. They carried infections. They carried chess sets, basketballs, Vietnamese English dictionaries, insignia of rank, bronze stars and purple hearts, plastic cards imprinted with the code of conduct. They carried diseases, among them malaria and dysentery. They carried lice and ringworm and leeches and paddy algae and various rots and molds. They carried the land itself, Vietnam, the place, the soil, a powdery orange-red dust that covered their boots and fatigues and their faces, end quote. And so begins Tim O'Brien's magnum opus, a contemporary classic in every sense of the phrase, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, a staple in the American public education system, and today's Velshi Band Book Club feature, The Things They Carried. Originally published in 1990, The Things They Carried is a fictionalized account of Tim O'Brien's very real experience as a young soldier in the U.S. Army's 23rd Infantry Division during the Vietnam War. At the center of the book are the men of the Alpha Company, Jimmy Cross, Kurt Lemon, Henry Dobbins, Rat Kiley, Ted Lavender, Mitchell Sanders, a man known only as Kiowa, and O'Brien himself. Moving back and forth through time and switching between first and third person storytelling, the book is comprised of a series of interconnected short stories, but to call it just a war story is too reductive. The Things They Carried explores the futility of war, the power of friendship, and the motivating effect of death, shame, morality, isolation, and survival. From the very first chapter, O'Brien uses repetition, reflection, and frank language to illustrate how inescapable and all-encompassing trauma is. The result is suffocating and hugely effective. O'Brien shows us that when you witness death, that moment replays in your mind again and again and again. The reader only has to endure the way Kurt Lemon's face shone in the sun before he stepped on a landmine for the duration of this book. But for O'Brien, that story never ends. For a readership that is likely unfamiliar with the Vietnam War, the politics behind it, and the state of the country in 1969, The Things They Carried is a revelation. The book is told largely through flashbacks and memories. In one particularly stirring story, we see a young O'Brien contemplating making a run for the Canadian border after receiving his draft notice. But the most salient and vivid moments in the book take place in Vietnam. In the pages of The Things They Carried, the war is equal parts hallucinatory and concrete, surreal and corporeal. O'Brien captures what the psyche and the spirit must do to protect us from the horrors of war. But he also captures the heart-wrenching moments of friendship, of sacrifice, and of beauty. From Iowa to New Jersey to Texas, this book has become a fixture in high school English classes for obvious reasons. And across all those states, The Things They Carried has been challenged for ban and removed from shelves. The most common complaint is that it's vulgar and profane. O'Brien has an answer for them in the pages of the book. Quote, "You can tell a true war story if it embarrasses you. If you don't care for obscenity, you don't care for the truth. If you don't care for the truth, watch how you vote. Send guys to war, they come home talking dirty." But what really is at the core of removing a book by an American author about an American war from an American school or a library? If powerful literature is a mirror unto yourself and a window into other worlds, then perhaps a commentary so salient about the hell that the Vietnam War was, the hell that every war is a place those people don't want to take a glimpse of at all. Right after the break, I'm joined by Tim O'Brien himself, the literary legend, and the author of today's Velshi Band Book Club feature, The Things They Carried. Today's meeting of the Velshi Band Book Club is officially underway. I'm joined by Tim O'Brien, critically acclaimed author of today's important Velshi Band Book Club feature, The Things They Carried. Tim, welcome to the Velshi Band Book Club, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me on.
I want to start with two of the themes that recur throughout the book, guilt and shame. These emotions come up literally for every character. Here's one instance of it. When a man died, there had to be blame. Jimmy Cross understood this. You could blame the war. You could blame the idiots who made the war. You could blame Kiowa for going into it. You could blame the rain. You could blame the river. You could blame the field. You could blame the mud, the climate. You could blame the enemy. You could blame the mortar rounds. You could blame people who were too lazy to read a newspaper, who were bored by the daily body counts, who switched channels at the mention of politics. You could blame whole nations. You could blame God, end quote. Talk to me about this guilt and shame, how it figures into this book and how it exists more broadly in war.
Well, killing is a nasty thing. And when one is immersed in the crankcase evil of war, you take it personally. It's not, the issues aren't of politics, of stopping communism. Rather, you're embroiled in a second-by-second experience that's horrific. And you, at the end of that experience, when the shooting stops and it's time to turn in for the night, you find yourself rehearsing what you'd gone through that day, going through it again and again in your head. And in the end, many of us assign guilt and shame to ourselves. We weren't quite brave enough. We weren't quite macho enough. We hesitated at times. We were terrified. And you can blame yourself for all those things, being terrified. And you can also blame yourself for the deaths of your friends. I wasn't at his side. I didn't respond quickly enough. You carry all kinds of emotions from the war. Great love for your fellow soldiers, great love for life itself. You appreciate things you had never appreciated before. Good McDonald's hamburger and fresh air and the peace that surrounds you in civilian life in a way you'd never appreciated it before. So all of these emotions congeal into an experience that I tried to at least do my best to, replicate in the pages of the things it carried. It's an emotional book. I think it's an honest book. It's a way of checking out of telling lies, which apparently MAGA America has now fallen in love with ideological fairy tales. And some of those ideological fairy tales are about war itself, American soldiers.
Yep.
And they're always behaving righteously. They don't cuss, they don't use profanity. But as a writer, it feels that's my obligation in the pages of a work of fiction to do my best to be forthright and honest. You can't have a soldier badly wounded saying, gee willikers, I've been shot. Soldiers just don't talk that way.
Yep.
But a portion of America wants that fairy tale.
I think it's interesting because what I read in the introduction about how you, within the book, addressed why people, how people should deal with their profanity in it, and in this quote that I just read to you about blaming people who are too lazy to read a newspaper, who are bored by the daily body counts, who switch channels at the mention of politics, that still exists today. I mean, we could be discussing today the idea that we don't realize the consequences of death, of war, of soldiering. People do say it's too much for me. I don't want to pay attention to it.
I think you're absolutely right. It's with us today. In fact, I think it's compounded big time. These fairy tales I mentioned about the world are all around us now. And part of the job of a writer is to be an iconoclast, to fight back against what seems to be dishonesty. And the chief obligation of any writer, no matter what your subject, whether it's war, politics, whatever it might be, love affairs, your obligation is to try to the best of your ability to be honest and forthright. Sometimes the world is a nasty place. Oftentimes it's a joyful, great place. But when you're writing about war, you do have to be honest about yourself, your own experience, and the fundamental evil of people killing other people.
So against that, you also write about the idea of healing through storytelling. I'm going to read from your book. Telling stories seemed a natural, inevitable process, like clearing the throat, partly catharsis, partly communication. It was a way of grabbing people by the shirt and explaining exactly what had happened to me, how I'd allowed myself to get dragged into a wrong war, all the mistakes I'd made, all the terrible things I'd seen and done. Talk to me about the power of stories, not just for healing, as you referred to it here, but as warning.
Well, story is one of the most powerful human experiences, both in making a story and reading a story. It takes you out of yourself and puts you in the shoes of other human beings. You could go down the river with Huckleberry Finn, or you can go to sea with Joseph Conrad's Typhoon or Heart of Darkness. And story lasts in a way that facts sometimes diminish over time. They're forgotten. They blur into other facts. But a story puts you in a situation. War, killing becomes not an abstract thing. Even the word war seems to me abstract. It doesn't encompass the mosquitoes and the mud and the filth of it. Not bathing for days, walking through the jungles and up into the mountains and down back to the jungles, just the daily physical pain of it all. And then later on top of that, killing people. That's your job in a war. And to try to stay alive while you're doing the killing. It takes a toll on the human soul. And you come back from an experience like that into a world of civility and decency and human concord and polite conversations on street corners. Mm-hmm. But part of your head is back in the filth of the war. And it's not going to go away any more than a woman could forget coming down with breast cancer. You're not going to relieve yourself of the memory of that, it stays with you forever. And story is a way of bringing that back alive for others, for high school, college kids, and for future generations.
Yeah.
One of the best books ever written about war is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. I read it back in my early high school years, and I've reread it a couple of times since. And it brings me back to something I didn't experience, the Civil War, what that was like.
Yeah.
So story matters.
On Friday, somewhat out of the blue, Donald Trump posted this on his social media platform. I know nothing about Project 2025. I have no idea who is behind it. I disagree with some of the things they're saying, and some of the things they're saying are absolutely ridiculous and abysmal. Anything they do, I wish them luck, but I have nothing to do with them. Now, from the get-go, we all know that wasn't true, so we set out to debunk it. And honestly, I thought there might be a little more legwork involved in spelling out the web of connections between Donald Trump and Project 2025. But then I realized all you have to do is look at the table of contents of Project 2025. Let's literally go through it. The author of each section is listed right here, and I'm just going to list them. Forward, A Promise to America, written by Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation. Trump has name-checked the Heritage Foundation several times, including just a few months ago when he wrote that Roberts, quote, should keep going and get the word out. Chapter 1 on the White House office was written by Rick Dearborn, Trump's former White House deputy chief of staff. Chapter 2 on the executive office of the President of the United States was written by Russell Vought, who is Trump's former director of the Office of Management and Budget. Chapter 3 on managing the bureaucracy was co-written by former advisor to Ronald Reagan, Donald Devine, along with Dennis Dean Kirk, a Trump nominee for the chair of the Merit Systems Protection Board, and Paul Dans, a Trump appointee to the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. Paul Dans is the director of all of Project 2025. Okay, Chapter 4 on the Department of Defense, written by Christopher Miller, who was Donald Trump's acting Secretary of Defense from November 2020 through the end of his term. Want me to keep going? Okay. Chapter 5 on the Department of Homeland Security, written by Ken Cuccinelli, Donald Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security. Chapter 6 on the Department of State, written by Kieron Skinner, the Director of Policy Planning for Donald Trump's State Department. Roger Severino, known to be aggressively anti-abortion rights and anti-LGBTQ plus rights, and who served as Donald Trump's Director of the Office of Civil Rights for the Department of Health and Human Services, well, he wrote the chapter on that department. Peter Navarro, who served as Trump's top trade advisor, he's currently in prison for contempt of Congress, authored part of the chapter on trade. The more you look in here, the more you find. If you look at the Heritage Foundation's website, you can see that the associate director of Project 2025 is a former special assistant to Donald Trump. Here's the Heritage Foundation's press release. Quote, John McEntee, former director of the White House Presidential Personnel Office in the Trump administration, is joining the 2025 Presidential Transition Project, Project 2025, as a senior advisor. Some of the organizations listed as part of Project 2025's advisory board are led by top Trump allies, like the former Trump chief of staff, Mark Meadows, who now leads the Conservative Partnership Institute, and the former Trump advisor, Stephen Miller, who now is president of America First Legal. I literally don't have enough time to list every connection between Donald Trump and Project 2025, but I can absolutely confidently say that Donald Trump's claim that he, quote, knows nothing about Project 2025 and has, quote, no idea who's behind it, end quote, is, how do we say it in Canada? Complete and utter BS. Another Supreme Court term came to a close last week, and we are stepping into a new era created by the court's radical remaking of American law. We've already seen the conservative supermajority on the court roll back long-held personal rights and force the country to the right with its overturning of Roe v. Wade and its gutting of affirmative action. But the brazenness with which this court has operated during this year's historic term has been a shock to the system. In the past few months alone, the justices handed Donald Trump multiple lifelines, including a major victory that could help him avoid criminal prosecution, even for trying to overturn the results of an election and for leading an insurrection. The court's decision on presidential immunity could fundamentally reshape the federal government, as could a series of decisions that strips the regulatory powers of the administrative state. But none of this happened by accident. The transformation of the Supreme Court has been part of a decades-long effort spearheaded by something called the Federalist Society, a nationwide organization and a professional network of conservative lawyers. It's a leading proponent of originalism, an approach to interpreting laws based on the plain meaning of the text of the Constitution and how it was understood at the time that it was written. It's an approach that ultimately led to the fall of Roe. Since it was founded in 1982, the Federalist Society has been a resource for generations of conservative lawyers and jurists and other legal minds, and the group has also helped many of them rise up the ranks of the judiciary. All 6 of the conservative justices on the Supreme Court today are current or former members of the Federalist Society. In fact, 5 of those 6 justices were chosen with the help of one man in particular. This man, Leonard Leo. He's a right-wing megadonor and co-chair of the Federalist Society. In the early 2000s, he helped George W. Bush choose John Roberts and Samuel Alito for the Supreme Court. Years later, Donald Trump turned to Leo and his organization for advice as well. During an interview with Breitbart, while on the campaign trail back in 2016, Donald Trump said, quote, "We're going to have great judges, conservative, all picked by the Federalist Society." Leo helped Trump create short lists of possible Supreme Court picks, and all 3 of Trump's eventual nominees, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, came from lists that Leonard Leo created. The majority of Trump's other nominees to the federal bench were current or former members of the Federalist Society as well, but Leonard Leo's influence goes beyond his work in reshaping the federal courts. He's also been supporting Project 2025, the blueprint for the next conservative administration, and that's been coordinated by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. Last month, in a press release announcing the formation of a task force to counter Project 2025, the Democratic Congressman Jared Huffman noted, quote, "More than half the groups supporting Project 2025 effort have received $21.5 million in funding from Leonard Leo's dark money network," end quote. While Trump recently claimed that he knows nothing about Project 2025, and I'll have more on that in a few minutes, many of his past and present colleagues, including Leo, are deeply involved in the effort. It's important to note that Project 2025 is not just about the draconian policies that conservatives want to impose on Americans. It's also about how conservatives want to radically change how the federal government works, from expanding the powers of the presidency to installing loyalists throughout every level of government, to packing the courts with Federalist Society-backed jurists, and by granting broad immunity to the president and essentially dismantling the administrative state. The conservative supermajority that currently dominates the Supreme Court just made some of Project 2025's key goals much more achievable. Joining me now is Kermit Roosevelt III. He's a professor of constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's the author of the book, The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story. Professor Roosevelt, good to see you again. The conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court presents a specific challenge that is not easily undone. Generally, justices retire when the person in the White House is ideologically aligned with them, which means we could have a conservative majority for a while. We could see the replacement of a couple of the older justices in a second Trump term. Tell me about this. Is this a flaw in the system, or is this just a fluke and a coincidence of timing?
Well, it's absolutely a flaw in the system. So when the framers wrote the Constitution, they weren't thinking about political parties. They weren't thinking about the Supreme Court as a power center that the parties would fight over. And so to them, it didn't really matter how many justices a president got to appoint. But now we have a system where the two parties are fighting to control the court. And if you had a rational system, their ability to do that, the number of justices a president can put on the court, would have something to do with winning national elections. So the Democrats have won 5 of the last 8 presidential elections. They've won 7 out of the last 8 popular votes. But we've got this 6-3 Republican supermajority. And that really doesn't make any sense in terms of how we staff the court.
Let's talk a little bit about the Federalist Society and its role. It has been remarkably successful over the course of several decades. The Federalist Society has gotten a boost from the likes of Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell, who recognized the value in transforming the judiciary and then acted on it. Tell me about how we should be thinking about the Federalist Society and its role in our government and politics.
Well, we should be thinking about the Federalist Society as a very far-ranging, wide-reaching, influential organization. But what I was saying before is I think we need to think more about the structure of judicial appointments and the structure in particular of Supreme Court appointments. Because the fact that you've got the Federalist Society grooming these future justices and putting them forward to presidents, it wouldn't matter so much if we had a rational system for putting justices on the court where it mattered if you won a presidential election, not if you got lucky when some justice died.
Let's talk a little bit about this structure of the Supreme Court. There have been several ideas floated, impeachment of justices. Some people say that there is a political issue with that, in that impeachment of the president has now become a tit-for-tat, back-and-forth thing. Let's talk about the expansion of the court and what your thoughts are about that possibility.
Yeah, so generally, I think there are two problems. One is a structural problem, which is what I was talking about before. The way that we staff the Supreme Court just doesn't work. And term limits is the solution to that. But the other problem, which is more immediate, is we're seeing this attack on the very foundations of our constitutional government. So the Supreme Court is reshaping our constitutional structure. It's going to tear out the bureaucracy, which is what gives stability to the country. It's going to empower the president, which means when you get a Republican president, they're going to be able to do what they want. They're going to be able to implement this crazy MAGA agenda. And so the only way to take the Supreme Court back in the near term is actually court expansion. So you need to add justices to get us to the balance that we would be at if we'd been appointing justices in a reasonable way rather than the sort of random strategic retirement death way that we've been doing it.
And in fact, compared to other democracies and size of country, our Supreme Court is actually small. And in fact, relative to its workload, it's small. But how do you expand the court and not make that an ongoing political situation so that in 10 years we've got 45 court members? You have to expand the court and then engage in some sort of structural reset of the way the court is done. You talk about expanding the court so that we're in balance. Then what happens?
Well, then we should have term limits. And then we should hope that, the other side accepts this as a reasonable way to go forward. Because when people say, oh, you can't expand the court, you're going to set off this retaliatory cycle of tit for tat, they don't seem to understand we're already in that process. So when the Senate said we're not going to consider Merrick Garland, they were shrinking the court, right? We're not going to consider any Obama nominee. And they said they'd do it to Hillary Clinton if she won too. They're taking the court down to 8. When Trump wins, they take it back up to 9. So they're manipulating the size of the court for partisan advantage. And, that can't be an option that's just not on the table for Democrats.
What does expansion of the court can be done now? What does imposing term limits require in terms of the work to get that done?
So one of the interesting things here is court expansion seems more extreme, but that's clearly constitutional. Term limits, it's arguable that's unconstitutional. You might need an amendment. But the proposal that I've worked on most closely is you just say each president gets 2 appointments per 4-year presidential term, and the justices are in active service for 18 years, and then after that they rotate into something like senior status, which is what they do now when they retire.
I want to ask you.
So you put them on regularly, you take them off regularly.
Got it. And that's typical of other Supreme Court systems in the world. There's some things about America's system that are just atypical. Is there any real explanation for that, or is that we set up our Supreme Court system under a democracy before a lot of similar countries did?
Yeah, I think other countries learned from our mistakes in some sense, because our system of appointing justices is crazy. Our system of taking them off the court is crazy too. So no other industrialized democracy in the world has chosen life tenure. A lengthy fixed term, like 18 years, is enough for everyone else in the world. And for the states too, right? The states don't do it, our U.S. states. No one else does this. And it's pretty clear we wouldn't do it if we were starting over.
I want to talk about this Project 2025 situation. It's not the first time that the Heritage Foundation has put out a playbook like this. It's not even the weirdest thing in the world that an outside group would do it. It usually is left to either the candidate or the party to put out a platform. But why is this so concerning in light of the fact that the Heritage Foundation and these conservative thinkers seem to have a willing participant in Donald Trump? He's, depending on what day, he seems to be distancing himself from it or not. But it does look like a playbook for the next administration.
Yeah, it does. So the Republicans didn't have a platform last time, and their position now seems to be, we're just the party of Trump, whatever Trump wants. So then you have to ask, well, where's Trump going to go? Who's putting these ideas out there? And Project 2025 is a terrifying blueprint for an authoritarian future. And if they can succeed in this, and the Supreme Court is helping them at this point by weakening the administrative state, if they can succeed in this, it's going to be a very different country. It's going to be an America that you won't recognize.
Kermit Roosevelt III, we always appreciate your time. Kermit Roosevelt III is a professor for the Administration of Justice and professor of constitutional law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's the author of the book, The Nation That Never Was, Reconstructing America's Story. Principle that no one is above the law is one of our most cherished values. The rule of law, the idea that laws apply equally to all members of society, is fundamental to American democracy, distinguishing us from the autocracies and despots of the world. That desire for a just and lawful system of government was a driving force behind the American Revolution and the creation of the United States. The U.S. Constitution, which enshrines this notion, stands as the supreme law of the land to which everyone, from government officials and the president to citizens like you and me, is bound. This week, the Supreme Court tossed aside a cherished bedrock, effectively anointing us with an imperial presidency, declaring that a president's official acts are completely immune from criminal prosecution. The Supreme Court, as the chief guardian of the American rule of law, had a clear mandate in Trump v. the United States to declare that a president cannot obstruct the peaceful transfer of power as outlined in the Constitution. Instead, the court's conservative supermajority seemed to determine that the president now stands above the law. As noted by the legal scholar Akhil Reed Amar, the justices essentially ruled that the U.S. Constitution is itself unconstitutional. They then sent the entire case back to the district judge, Tanya Chutkan, to determine whether Trump's actions on January 6th were official acts. Yesterday, Vice President Kamala Harris underscored the gravity of the Supreme Court's ruling.
When the United States Supreme Court essentially told this individual who has been convicted of 34 felonies that he will be immune from essentially the activity he has told us he is prepared to engage in if he gets back into the White House. Understand what we all know. In 122 days, we each have the power to decide what kind of country we want to live in.
The Supreme Court's decision to remand the case ensures that Trump's election interference trial, if it continues at all, will extend beyond the November 5th election, giving him exactly what he wants, after which he may shut down the case entirely, obviously, if he becomes president. But beyond delay, the damage to our system of government is profound. Commenting on the dangerous implications of the ruling, Michael Waldman, the president and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice, writes, quote, Trump v. United States astounds in its implications. It grants the president the power of a monarch. Richard Nixon defended his conduct in Watergate, telling interviewer David Frost, when the president does it, it means it's not illegal. Effectively, the Supreme Court supermajority has now enshrined that brazen claim. For justices who often wax poetic about originalism and the importance of adhering to history and tradition, they seem to have skipped the part in our history where the founders published a series of essays pushing for the ratification of the Constitution. Specifically, they missed the part where the Federalist Papers stressed the importance of a government of laws, not a government of men. The bedrock notion that those who govern must also be subject to the law, unlike a king. The founders repeatedly emphasized that presidents have no special immunity, as noted by historians who submitted an amicus brief to the court. But none of this seemed to matter to this particular Supreme Court, with its alarming record of shredding precedent and rolling back hard-won rights and constraints on judicial authority. From the outset, the case was stacked against the people. Flags carried in the insurrection were seen flying outside the homes of Justice Samuel Alito. Justice Clarence Thomas's wife was deeply involved in Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election. Had they recused themselves, the case may have well been decided differently, especially given Justice Amy Coney Barrett's partial concurrence, which proposed a narrower form of presidential immunity. In his latest piece for The Atlantic titled, "Something Has Gone Deeply Wrong at the Supreme Court," my next guest writes, quote, "Instead of properly starting with the Constitution's text and structure, the court has ended up repealing them. No one is above the law, or at least no one should be, not presidents, not ex-presidents, and not justices either, because the Constitution itself is our highest law. Jurists across the spectrum must prioritize that document's letter and spirit above all else. In Trump v. United States, the court failed to do this and also failed to live up to America's highest ideals, nonpartisan justice and the rule of law," end quote. I'm now joined by the author of that piece, the eminent constitutional law scholar, Akhil Reed Amar. He's the professor of law and political science at Yale University. He's the host of the podcast, America's Constitution. He's the author of several important books, including Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation. Akhil, great to have you here in person. And you are someone under whom many of our constitutional scholars and legal minds and Supreme Court justices have read or studied from. So to have you take such a strong position on this reinforces the idea that many of us non-lawyers have, that this felt weird and wrong.
This is one of the worst decisions in all of constitutional history. And since you mentioned my students, I am very proud of them. You had one of them on earlier, Kermit Roosevelt.
Yep.
You also had a graphic from another one, William Bode. William Bode is a Federalist Society superstar. He clerked for John Roberts. He's conservative. He's the most cited person by the court itself under age 50. He's a former teaching assistant of mine. Very proud of him. Very critical of this case in the New York Times. And I would encourage your audience to read that one. Sai Prakash, one of my other proteges, clerked for Thomas O. Bode, clerked for the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice loves Bode. Sai Prakash is also, I think, one of the 5 most cited people by the Supreme Court, a winner of Federalist Society awards, as is Will Bode, conservative, cited by the dissenters in this case. The court says it believes in originalism. That's the text of the Constitution, its history and structure. Let's hold them to that. The dissenters actually made a compelling case. And it's just really easy for your audience, because this is short. You can read the thing.
Yes.
It talks about bribery. And it says when a president accepts a bribe, for example, he can be impeached. One day she. And after impeachment, they're subject to criminal prosecution just like everyone else. And yet the court somehow said, oh, no, if a president commits bribery, we could never actually have, once out of office, criminal proceedings against that ex-president. That is what I meant when I said it's making the Constitution itself unconstitutional. And read it for yourselves, ladies.
Yes, it's as we often say, and I know you and many folks like you carry them because
multiple copies. I'm sure I've got 3 or 4 more.
No doubt. And they're small and they're easy to carry.
Yes.
and they're fantastic.
Here's another one.
I love it. He's literally got 3 constitutions in his pocket.
Yeah.
William Bode, you talked about his piece in the New York Times. You literally have another one. Look at that. You have 4. Let me read that to you. It says, the problem is that the statesmanship is a form of the kind of outcome-oriented policymaking that the court disparages in other contexts. It trusts states to handle the homelessness crisis, but not ballot access for insurrectionists. It trusts juries to handle fines for securities fraud, but not punishment for abuse of the presidency, even though the Constitution trusts juries with both. When dealing with Mr. Trump in particular, the court is so sure that our other institutions cannot be trusted that it fails to look in the mirror. It's profound. What should we read out of this?
That an eminent conservative, beloved by the Federalist Society and John Roberts, is saying, friends, you've gone too far. And they have credibility, conservatives, with other conservatives in a way that liberals, frankly, don't. So that was courageous. That's a profile in courage, and I hope the justices listen to their friend Will Bode.
If you're an optimist about this, and you say, okay, Tanya Chutkan or other judges can make determinations as to what in the insurrection was an official act and what wasn't, because there are clearly things that were not official acts. Rudy Giuliani did not have a role in the government at the time. Others didn't have a role. Sidney Powell didn't have a role. But to the extent that the Supreme Court has said that communications with officials of the Justice Department would be protected as official acts, how do you address the idea that what happens if you're communicating with people in an official capacity, but you're in the commission of a crime? while president.
And there was an incoherence in footnote 3. The audience can read the opinions themselves of the majority. And at page 18, they say, oh, motive doesn't matter. The word bribery in the Constitution tells us that motive matters. They came up with something that's not just in violation of the Constitution, but is incoherent, internally contradictory. I don't envy Judge Chutkan because trying to make sense of this a pile is going to be difficult. Here's what I'm most hoping for. Because it's incoherent, she'll do her best. The issue will percolate back up. And it's not about Donald Trump. It's about going forward. You know, it's about 2050. It's about 2100 if the Republic lasts this long. But I'm hopeful that it'll go back up and the court actually, if it's got the integrity that I believe it does, and I believe in the court, will say, oops, we made a mistake. We've taken an oath to this. We believe in this. We've said that we believe in this in all the other cases, and there have been times in history where the court actually reversed itself very quickly.
I was going to say, does it happen?
I'll give you my specific example.
Yeah.
Today, the government can't force students, to pledge allegiance to the flag. Right. Some of them have religious objections to that, and others have philosophical objections, and it's bedrock constitutional law that the government can't force students to pledge allegiance. Now, the Supreme Court originally, in a case called Gobaitis in 1941, said, oh, that's perfectly fine. And then there was an outrage. People saying, no, actually, and these were religious kids, actually, and they were being punished for following their faith and exercising their free expression rights. There was massive pushback. Pundits talked about it like you and I are doing, and the court reversed itself 2 years later in a very famous case, West Virginia versus Barnett. They said, actually, we made a mistake. We took another look at the Constitution, and we realized it says something different than what we said before.
Interesting. Well, you've given us hope. Akhil, good to see you. Thank you for coming in, making the time to actually be with us and bringing, I've now counted 4 constitutions, and I'm sure he's not finished. He's not cleared all his pockets yet. The noted constitutional scholar, Akhil Reed Amar, professor of law and political science at Yale University, host of America's Constitution podcast, and author of multiple important books about the Constitution, including The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation. And I can attest to carrier of many copies of the Constitution. All right, joining me now is the Democratic Senator Peter Welch of Vermont. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator, thank you for being with us this morning. Got a lot of stuff to cover with you, especially given your expertise with the Judiciary Committee and the conversation that I had with Professor Roosevelt a little while ago. But let's get right to Project 2025 for the moment. The Heritage Foundation president, Kevin Roberts, has said, quote, we're in the process of a second American revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be, end quote, which sounds a little like a veiled threat and sounds like it leans into this violence that Donald Trump brings up all the time. But how do you respond to that and the weirdness around Project 2025? It's out there. Donald Trump now trying to distance himself from the organization and from Project 2025, which is an impossibility because it's a creature of the very people who surrounded and will surround Donald Trump.
Well, first of all, there's nothing veiled about that threat. That is a real threat. What we saw with January 6th was the adoption by the Trump folks, his supporters, of violence as a tool of political persuasion. And I really appreciate you going through that 2025 because it is extremely radical. It is going to get rid of 50,000 civil servants to put in ideologically committed Trumpites. And the goal is to totally remake in their own image, not in a democratic image, in their own image, a government that they want. And that would include, by the way, a few more Supreme Court justices to join the radical right. Also, that you said veiled threat. There's nothing veiled about that. That is an indication, Steve Bannon said it, that the process will be peaceful unless there's resistance. And resistance then may necessitate violence. So this gets back to why this question of our candidacy and what's going on and what happened with the debate is so urgent. The existential challenge for this country, and certainly for the Democratic Party as the main opposition to Trump, is to beat Trump. We have to win this election.
Stuart Stevens yesterday on the show from the Lincoln Project was saying that what might help Democrats, in addition to emphasizing policy successes and the fight against the limitations on abortion, is to lean into Project 2025, which is a big project because it's 900 pages. It's dense. It's a lot of stuff. People are not all that likely to read it. But do you think there's benefit in, as somebody who runs for office, as somebody who has to deal with constituents, is there benefit in trying to spell this out for Americans to say, your vote, even if it's a protest vote against Joe Biden, could end up voting for this very, very dangerous platform?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Project 2025 is the blueprint. And that is sort of the government in waiting if Donald Trump is reelected. And what's so dangerous about Trump this time, even more than last time, is he came in with some people and made mistakes. Like he put in a patriot like General Mattis to be in charge of the military. He's not going to make that mistake again. It's going to be yes men and yes women. And they are laying out the agenda they want from day one, and they've been working on it very hard. So talking about this is very, very important. Winning is the most essential. And we've got this situation now in the party where we are dealing with the age question that it was intensified as a result of that debate on last Thursday.
And how do you think that should be handled at this point? We understand that some of your Senate colleagues, or Mark Warner at least, of Virginia, is attempting to assemble some Senate Democrats to have a conversation with the president. What's your sense of how this should play out in a way that allows us to focus on actual threats to democracy and not go down too many rabbit holes for too long?
All right, here's the situation for us in the Democratic Party. We love Joe Biden. No one more than the state of Vermont. He got his highest percentage here. He is really generous and kind. He's been a very effective president, best agenda, I think, since LBJ. And he beat Trump. And the question now is the age question. When age casts its gaze on any of us, we all resist. But age will have its way. We all succumb. And we have to have, number one, a commitment to winning. Number two, that requires us to address how best do we win, what is our best candidate in the given situation. And it has to be somebody that can win in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So we as a party have a loyalty to one another and to the party, but the party has to have, first and foremost, the loyalty to serving the people of this country. And the job for our party is to defeat Donald Trump.
What's the timeline on this? How long can Democrats afford to be continuing to have this discussion?
I think just a couple of weeks. Now, first of all, it's going to be President Biden's decision. You know, he did a great job, and he was elected as he's the overwhelming selection of Democrats to be the nominee. And now we have this very unusual situation, unprecedented really, where there's a lot of questions about age. Those questions were there going into the debate. They've been intensified coming out. So if we're honest with ourselves and acknowledge that the American people have a question, we have to deal with that. And, you know, in the Stephanopoulos interview, the president, I think, was suggesting if the Lord Almighty came down, he might listen. But the bottom line here is it is Sunday. But bottom line, this is not a decision for Lord Almighty. This is a real world decision for real world people in politics and who care about our country to decide what we think is the best path forward. And it has to be the best path to give us the best chance of keeping Donald Trump in Project 2025 out of the White House.
Okay, so you said it shouldn't go on for more than a couple of weeks. It will be Joe Biden's decision, and the best path forward is the path that's going to allow to make sure that Donald Trump is defeated. Does that lead you to a conclusion as to what decision President Biden should make?
Well, I certainly have thoughts about it, but one of the things that I do think we owe President Biden is the respect that he's earned through a lifetime of service where he's always made his decisions through thick and thin, through personal tragedy and political setback. His decisions have always been what's best for the country. And that's where I hope the president, his advisors, don't refer to the Lord Almighty. They start listening to Democratic voters. They start listening to people in politics, in the Senate, in the House, take that into consideration and take their time but at the end of the day, make that decision on their honest assessment of what is best for the country to keep Donald Trump in Project 2025 way out of the White House.
Senator Peter Welch, good to see you. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.